The mountain wind howled through the pines as Sarah James pressed her back against the rough bark of an ancient fir, her wedding dress torn and muddied beyond recognition. The delicate silk that had cost her father 3 months' wages now hung in tatters, catching on every branch and stone during her desperate flight up the mountainside. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale forming small clouds in the crisp autumn air. Behind her, she could hear the distant shouts of the search party, their voices growing closer with each passing moment. Tyler Ross emerged from the shadows between the trees, his weathered face unreadable in the fading light. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged to these mountains, every step deliberate and sure despite the treacherous terrain. His dark eyes took in her disheveled appearance, the fear written plainly across her face in the way she clutched the remnants of her veil like a lifeline. "They're coming for you," he said simply, his voice low and steady. "Question is, do you want to be found?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at this stranger who had appeared like some mythical guardian of the wilderness. She had heard whispers about the mountain man who lived in the high country, stories told in hushed tones around kitchen tables and general store counters. Some said he was dangerous. Others claimed he was touched by madness from too many years alone. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw only calm certainty and something that might have been understanding. "I can't go back," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I won't go back." Tyler nodded once, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. Without another word, he turned and began moving deeper into the forest, his long stride eating up the ground with practiced ease. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before following, her torn skirts making each step a struggle as she fought to keep pace with her unlikely rescuer. The voices behind them grew fainter as Tyler led her along paths that seemed invisible to her untrained eye. He moved like a ghost through the underbrush, never breaking a twig or disturbing the fallen leaves, while Sarah crashed along behind him like a wounded animal. When she stumbled, he was there to steady her. When her dress caught on thorns, he freed it without comment. His silence was not cruel but protective, conserving energy for the journey ahead. As full darkness settled over the mountains, Tyler finally called a halt in a small clearing sheltered by towering pines. The space felt hidden from the world, a secret pocket of wilderness where no search party would think to look. He moved with efficient purpose, gathering dry wood and kindling a small fire that would provide warmth without betraying their location with too much light or smoke. Sarah sank onto a fallen log, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The adrenaline that had carried her through her escape was finally beginning to fade, leaving her hollow and shaking. She stared into the dancing flames, trying to process the events that had brought her to this moment. This morning she had been Sarah James, dutiful daughter and reluctant bride. Now she was something else entirely, though she wasn't sure what. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. "You're safe here," Tyler said, settling onto his haunches across from her. The firelight played across his rugged features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the network of fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into mountain weather. For tonight, anyway. Sarah looked up at him, this stranger who had appeared when she needed help most desperately. "Why are you helping me?" Tyler was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain, carefully controlled. "Because everyone deserves the right to choose their own path, even if that path leads into the wilderness." The story of how Sarah James came to be fleeing through the mountains in her wedding dress began 3 months earlier, in the comfortable parlor of her family's home in Cedar Falls. She had been sitting by the window reading a book of poetry when her father entered with the expression she had come to dread. Charles Torres, the town's most successful merchant and a man nearly twice her age, followed close behind. "Sarah, dear," her father had said, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness that always preceded unwelcome news. "Mr. Torres has something important to discuss with you." She had known, of course. The signs had been building for weeks. Her father's increasingly worried conversations with her mother about debts and declining business. The way Charles Torres had begun appearing at their dinner table with suspicious frequency, the meaningful looks exchanged between the adults while she pretended not to notice. "Miss James," Charles had said, removing his hat and smoothing his thinning hair, "I hope you'll do me the honor of becoming my wife." It wasn't really a question, and they all knew it. Her father's debts to Torres had grown beyond his ability to repay, and this marriage would solve both men's problems neatly. Sarah would gain financial security, and Torres would gain a young, presentable wife to grace his arm at social functions. What Sarah herself gained from the arrangement was never discussed. She had tried to protest, of course, had spoken of dreams and independence, of the teaching position that might open at the school in the spring. But her arguments fell on deaf ears. Her father spoke of duty and practicality. Her mother, when pressed, admitted tearfully that they had no choice. The alternative was losing their home, their business, everything they had worked to build. So Sarah had accepted because refusing would have meant watching her family lose everything. She had smiled and nodded and allowed herself to be fitted for a wedding dress she would never have chosen. She had endured the congratulations of neighbors who looked at her with a mixture of pity and envy. She had counted down the days to a future that felt like a prison sentence. The wedding preparations had proceeded with relentless efficiency. Charles Torres was not a man who believed in long engagements. He had business interests that required a wife's presence, social obligations that demanded a hostess. Sarah found herself swept along in a current of decisions made without her input, plans that assumed her compliance in all things. It was during one of these planning sessions, while listening to Charles discuss their honeymoon trip as if she were not present, that Sarah first began to seriously consider running. The idea started small, a whisper of rebellion that she tried to ignore. But as the wedding date approached, the whisper grew into a roar that drowned out all practical considerations. She began to plan in secret, hoarding small amounts of money and gathering supplies. She told herself she was being foolish, that she would never actually go through with it. But the preparations gave her something to focus on besides the growing dread that accompanied each passing day. The night before the wedding, she had lain awake staring at the ceiling of her childhood bedroom, knowing it would be the last time she slept there as Sarah James. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Charles Torres, and some essential part of herself would disappear forever. The thought made her feel as if she were suffocating. Morning had arrived with cruel brightness, and with it the parade of women who came to help her prepare. They fussed over her hair and makeup, exclaiming over the beauty of her dress and the good fortune of her match. None of them seemed to notice that the bride herself said almost nothing, moving through the preparations like a sleepwalker. The ceremony was to take place in the town's small church, followed by a reception at the hotel. Charles had spared no expense, determined that his wedding would be the social event of the season. Sarah watched the preparations with growing horror, feeling like a spectator at her own funeral. It was as she stood at the back of the church, waiting for the music that would signal her walk down the aisle, that the last of her resolve finally crumbled. She could see Charles at the altar, checking his pocket watch with the satisfied expression of a man about to close a profitable business deal. The assembled guests turned to look at her with expectant faces, ready to witness her transformation from person to possession. Sarah turned and ran. She pushed through the church doors and into the bright afternoon sun, her heavy skirts making each step a battle. Behind her, she heard gasps of shock and her father's voice calling her name. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. She ran down the main street of Cedar Falls, past the shops and houses where she had spent her entire life, toward the mountains that rose like a wall beyond the town's borders. The search party had been organized with military efficiency. Charles Torres was not a man who accepted setbacks gracefully, and the public humiliation of being left at the altar had transformed his business-like interest in marriage into something much more personal and vindictive. He had mobilized half the town in his pursuit, offering a substantial reward for Sarah's safe return and making it clear that her reputation would be in ruins if she didn't come back willingly. Sarah had run blindly at first, driven by pure panic and the desperate need to put distance between herself and the life that awaited her in Cedar Falls. Her wedding dress, designed for admiration rather than practical movement, had quickly become a liability. The long train caught on bushes and rocks, and the tight bodice made breathing difficult as she climbed higher into the mountains. But fear had given her strength she didn't know she possessed, and she had pushed deeper into the wilderness than any of her pursuers expected. The mountains that had always seemed like distant guardians from her bedroom window now surrounded her with their vast indifference, offering both sanctuary and danger in equal measure. As night fell on that first day, she had found herself lost and alone in country that bore no resemblance to the gentle hills around Cedar Falls. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and she had no shelter, no food, no idea which direction might lead to safety. The reality of her situation began to sink in, replacing panic with a cold understanding of just how precarious her position had become. It was then that Tyler Ross had found her, or perhaps she had found him. Later, she would never be entirely sure which was true. He had emerged from the darkness like something conjured by her desperate need, appearing at the moment when her strength was finally beginning to fail. Now, sitting by his carefully tended fire, Sarah studied the man who had become her unlikely protector. Tyler Ross was not what she had expected from the stories told about the hermit of the high country. Yes, he was weathered and rough around the edges, his clothes practical rather than fashionable, his hair longer than was considered proper in polite society. But there was an intelligence in his dark eyes that spoke of education and refinement, hints of a past that didn't match his current circumstances. "You're not what I expected," she said finally, her voice still hoarse from her flight through the mountains. Tyler looked up from the small pot of coffee he was brewing over the fire. "What did you expect?" "The stories make you sound like a wild man, dangerous, magged from too much solitude." A slight smile touched the corners of his mouth. "And what do you think now?" Sarah considered the question seriously. Tyler had shown her nothing but kindness since finding her, but she was still essentially alone, though. Alone in the wilderness with a man she knew nothing about. Common sense dictated that she should be afraid. Instead, she felt safer than she had in months. "I think the stories are told by people who don't understand the difference between choosing solitude and having it forced upon you." Tyler's smile widened slightly, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the man he might have been before whatever circumstances had driven him to the mountains. "You're perceptive. What brought you here?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." "It's a fair question, under the circumstances." Tyler poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her. The metal was warm against her cold fingers, and the bitter brew was the most welcome thing she had tasted in days. "I was a teacher once, back east, had a position at a good school, a woman I planned to marry, a future all mapped out in neat, predictable lines." He paused, staring into the fire. Sarah waited, sensing that this was a story rarely told. "Her name was Elizabeth," he continued. "Beautiful, accomplished, everything a man was supposed to want in a wife. But she was also cruel in ways that took me too long to recognize. She had a talent for finding people's weaknesses and exploiting them for her own amusement. I told myself it was just high spirits, that marriage would settle her." Sarah set down her cup, completely absorbed in his story. There was something in his voice that resonated with her own recent experiences, a recognition of the trap that social expectations could become. "The breaking point came when I discovered she had been systematically destroying the reputation of one of my students, a girl from a poor family who had earned a scholarship through exceptional academic performance. Elizabeth saw her as competition for attention and decided to eliminate the threat by spreading rumors about improper conduct." Tyler's jaw tightened with old anger. The girl was expelled in disgrace. Her family was shamed. Her future was destroyed. And all because Elizabeth couldn't bear to see someone else succeed through merit rather than privilege. "What did you do?" "I confronted Elizabeth, demanded she tell the truth and clear the girl's name. She laughed and told me that if I couldn't control my students better, perhaps I wasn't suited for teaching after all. Then she made it clear that if I pursued the matter, she would ensure that no school in the state would hire me." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The casual cruelty Tyler described was all too familiar. The way power could be wielded to destroy lives without consequence. "I broke our engagement," Tyler said simply, "and Elizabeth made good on her threat. Within a month, I was unemployed and unemployable. Her family had connections throughout the educational establishment, and they used them to ensure I would never teach again." "So you came here?" "So I came here, 5 years ago, with nothing but what I could carry and a determination to build a life where other people's opinions couldn't touch me." The fire crackled between them as Sarah absorbed Tyler's story. It explained so much about the man across from her, the careful way he moved through the world, the walls he had built around himself. But it also raised new questions about what her own future might hold. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Giving up everything to come here?" Tyler considered the question carefully. "I regret the circumstances that made it necessary. I regret that a good student's life was ruined because of my poor judgment in choosing a partner. But coming here? No, I found a kind of peace in these mountains that I never had in civilization." "Even alone?" "Especially alone. There's honesty in solitude, Sarah. No need to pretend to be something you're not. No pressure to conform to other people's expectations. Just you and the mountain, and the truth of who you really are." Sarah stared into the flames, thinking about the truth of who she really was. For so long, she had defined herself in relation to others. Dutiful daughter, reluctant bride, burden to her family. But sitting here in the wilderness, those identities seemed as insubstantial as smoke. "They'll keep looking for me," she said finally, "for a while. But Torres is a businessman first. Eventually, he'll cut his losses and find another bride, one who won't embarrass him at the altar." The casual way Tyler spoke of her replacement should have hurt, but instead, Sarah felt a strange sense of relief. If Charles Torres could so easily transfer his affections to another woman, it proved that his interest in her had never been personal. She had been a commodity, nothing more. "And my family?" Tyler's expression softened. "That's harder to say. They love you, but they also need to survive in that town. Forgiveness might come, but it won't come quickly." Sarah nodded, having already reached the same conclusion. Her flight had consequences that extended beyond her own future. Her family would face questions and judgment, their business would suffer, and her reputation would be destroyed beyond repair. The knowledge sat like a stone in her chest, but it didn't change her determination not to return. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends on what you want to happen." "I don't know. I've spent so long thinking about what I didn't want that I never really considered what I did want." Tyler stood and moved to the edge of the firelight, checking the perimeter of their small camp with the unconscious vigilance of a man accustomed to potential danger. When he returned, he settled back into his previous position, but closer to Sarah, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Winter's coming," he said. "These mountains aren't forgiving to those who aren't prepared. If you're serious about not going back, you'll need to learn quickly how to survive up here. Would you teach me?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was quite ready to examine. Tyler studied her face in the firelight, searching for something he seemed to find. "It won't be easy. Mountain life is hard even for those born to it. You'd be giving up every comfort you've ever known." "Comfort is a luxury I can no longer afford." Tyler nodded slowly. "Then we'll start tomorrow. First lesson is finding better shelter than this clearing. Winter storms can kill the unprepared in a matter of hours." As if summoned by his words, the wind picked up, sending sparks from their fire dancing into the darkness. Sarah pulled the remains of her wedding veil more tightly around her shoulders, a gesture that seemed to amuse Tyler. "We'll need to find you proper clothes too. That dress might be beautiful, but it's worse than useless up here." Sarah looked down at the ruined silk that had once represented her father's hopes and Charles Torres's expectations. In the firelight, the tears and stains looked like battle scars, evidence of her transformation from sheltered town girl to mountain refugee. "I never liked it anyway," she said, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. Tyler chuckled, a low sound that seemed to rumble up from somewhere deep in his chest. "Good. Attachment to pretty things will get you killed up here. The mountain doesn't care about appearances." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire burned lower, and Tyler banked it carefully to ensure it would last through the night without drawing unwanted attention. In the distance, an owl called, its voice echoing off the surrounding peaks. "Tyler," Sarah said suddenly, "why did you really help me? The truth this time." He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I recognized something in your eyes. The same thing I saw in my own reflection the day I left civilization behind. The look of someone who had reached the end of what they could endure." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, not of sadness, but of recognition. Here was someone who understood the weight of impossible choices, the courage required to walk away from everything familiar in search of something better. "Thank you," she said simply. Tyler met her gaze across the dying fire. "Don't thank me yet. Surviving up here will be the hardest thing you've ever done. There'll be times when you'll wish you had stayed in Cedar Falls and married Torres." "No," Sarah said with quiet certainty. "There won't." Dawn came slowly to the high country, filtering through the pine boughs and shafts of golden light that revealed the true scope of the wilderness surrounding them. Sarah woke stiff and cold, her wedding dress damp with dew, and her muscles protesting from a night spent on the hard ground. Tyler was already up, moving quietly around their camp as he prepared for the day ahead. "Coffee's ready," he said without looking at her, his voice carrying easily in the thin mountain air. Sarah accepted the tin cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth while she tried to work the kinks out of her neck. In the morning light, their situation seemed both more real and more impossible. She was a runaway bride in a torn wedding dress, dependent on a mountain hermit for survival, with no clear path forward and no way back. "The search party will be moving again soon," Tyler said, scanning the forest below their position. "We need to be gone before they reach this area." "Where will we go?" "Higher. There's a cabin about 6 miles up the ridge, well hidden and stocked with supplies. We can hole up there while we figure out your next move." Sarah stood carefully, testing her balance on legs that felt unsteady after the previous day's exertions. Every muscle in her body ached, and she was beginning to understand just how unprepared she was for the physical demands of mountain life. Tyler seemed to read her thoughts. "It gets easier. Your body will adapt if you give it time." "How long did it take you to adapt?" "Longer than I care to admit. I was soft when I first came here, used to a life of books and lecture halls. The mountains have a way of burning away everything that isn't essential." He shouldered a pack that seemed to contain everything he owned, then turned to study Sarah with a critical eye. "We need to do something about that dress. It's like a beacon for anyone tracking us." Sarah looked down at the white silk that stood out starkly against the muted colors of the forest. Tyler was right. She might as well be carrying a flag announcing her presence. "There's a stream about a quarter-mile from here," Tyler said. "The mud will help camouflage the color, and we can tear off some of the more impractical parts." The suggestion made practical sense, but Sarah felt an unexpected reluctance to further destroy the dress. It was the last tangible link to her old life, the final symbol of the woman she had been before yesterday's flight into the wilderness. Tyler seemed to understand her hesitation. Change is never easy, even when it's necessary, but holding on to things that no longer serve you can be dangerous up here. They made their way to the stream, a narrow ribbon of clear water that tumbled down from the higher elevations with musical persistence. Tyler kept watch while Sarah knelt by the water's edge and began the process of transforming her wedding dress into something more practical. The cold mountain water numbed her fingers as she worked, tearing away the long train and the delicate sleeves that had already been shredded by thorns and branches. She rubbed handfuls of mud into the white silk, watching as the pristine fabric took on the mottled brown and green of the forest floor. When she was finished, the dress bore no resemblance to the elegant garment that had cost her father so dearly. It was shorter now, ending just below her knees, and the bodice had been simplified to allow for easier movement. The transformation felt symbolic, a physical representation of her metamorphosis from sheltered town girl to mountain survivor. "Better," Tyler said when she rejoined him. "You'll blend in now instead of standing out like a sore thumb." They began the climb toward Tyler's hidden cabin, following paths that seemed invisible to Sarah's untrained eye. Tyler moved with the fluid grace of a man completely at home in the wilderness, while Sarah struggled to keep pace despite her shortened skirts and growing familiarity with the terrain. The higher they climbed, the more spectacular the views became. Cedar Falls was visible far below them, a collection of tiny buildings nestled in the valley like a child's toy village. Sarah could make out the church where she should have been married, the hotel where her reception should have taken place, the house where her parents were probably still dealing with the aftermath of her flight. "Second thoughts?" Tyler asked, noticing her backward glance. "No, just trying to remember why that life ever seemed important." Distance has a way of changing perspective. What seems crucial from up close often looks trivial from a higher vantage point. They pressed on, climbing steadily through forests of pine and aspen that grew more sparse as the altitude increased. The air grew thinner and colder, forcing Sarah to pause frequently to catch her breath. Tyler waited patiently each time, never showing impatience or frustration with her slower pace. "Tell me about the cabin," Sarah said during one of their rest stops. "It belonged to a trapper named George Reed. He died 3 winters ago, left the place to whoever might need it. I've maintained it since then, kept it stocked with supplies in case of emergency." "Is this an emergency?" Tyler looked at her seriously. "A woman fleeing an unwanted marriage with winter approaching and no survival skills? I'd say that qualifies." The cabin, when they finally reached it, was smaller than Sarah had expected, but solidly built and well-maintained. It sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a small creek running nearby, and a view of the distant peaks that took Sarah's breath away. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that Tyler had been here recently enough to keep the fire going. "Home sweet home," Tyler said, pushing open the heavy wooden door. The interior of the cabin was spartanly furnished but comfortable, with everything arranged for maximum efficiency and practicality. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a simple wooden table and 2 chairs positioned nearby. Shelves lined the walls, holding books, tools, and supplies. A narrow bed occupied one corner, while another corner held a small stove and cooking area. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry," Tyler said, setting his pack down near the door. Sarah stepped inside, feeling the blessed relief of being enclosed by solid walls after 2 days in the open. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and pine, with undertones of leather and something indefinably masculine that she was beginning to associate with Tyler himself. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. After the elaborate furnishings of her father's house and the ornate decorations Charles Torres had favored, the cabin's simple functionality felt like a revelation. Tyler moved around the space with easy familiarity, checking supplies and making small adjustments that spoke of long practice. Sarah watched him work, noting the careful way he handled everything, the unconscious grace with which he moved through the small space. "There's a root cellar under the floorboards," he said, lifting a section of the wooden floor to reveal a storage space below. George was a careful man, always prepared for the worst. "There's enough food here to last through the winter if it's managed properly." The practical implications of his words hit Sarah with sudden force. Winter. The word carried new weight now that she was dependent on stored supplies and Tyler's knowledge for survival. In Cedar Falls, winter had meant warmer clothes and higher heating bills. Here, it could mean the difference between life and death. "How long do the winters last up here?" she asked. "First snow usually comes in October. Last snow can be as late as May. 6 months of cold, with temperatures that can drop to 40 below on the worst nights." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. October was only weeks away, and she had no idea how to survive even a single night in weather that severe. Tyler seemed to read her growing panic. "Don't worry, we have time to prepare, and you'll learn faster than you think when your life depends on it." "We?" The word hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Tyler had been living alone in these mountains for 5 years, and Sarah had no right to assume he would want company for the long winter months ahead. "I mean, if you want to stay," she added quickly, "I don't want to impose on your solitude." Tyler was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "These mountains are dangerous for someone without experience. Staying alive through a mountain winter requires knowledge that takes years to acquire. You're welcome to remain here as long as necessary." It wasn't exactly a warm invitation, but it wasn't a rejection either. Sarah sensed that Tyler was struggling with his own conflicted feelings about having his carefully ordered solitude disrupted by her presence. "I'll try not to be too much trouble," she said. "Trouble has nothing to do with it, but you need to understand what you are committing to. Once the snows start, we'll be trapped here together until spring. No privacy, no escape from each other's company, no way out if things go wrong between us." The warning was clearly meant to give her a chance to reconsider, but Sarah found herself more determined than ever to stay. The alternative was returning to Cedar Falls in a life that would never truly be her own. "I understand," she said, "and I'm grateful for the chance." Tyler nodded once, the matter apparently settled in his mind. "Then we'd better start your education. First lesson, fire management. Up here, letting the fire go out can be a death sentence." For the rest of the day, Tyler taught Sarah the basics of mountain survival: how to bank a fire so it would burn safely through the night, how to read the weather signs that warned of approaching storms, how to identify edible plants and recognize the tracks of dangerous animals. Sarah absorbed the lessons eagerly, her mind sharp despite her physical exhaustion. She had always been a quick learner, and now her life depended on mastering skills that had never been part of her genteel education. As evening approached, Tyler began preparing their dinner from the cabin's stores: salt pork and beans, supplemented with wild onions he had gathered during their climb. It was simple fare, but after 2 days of running on nothing but fear and determination, Sarah found it delicious. "Tomorrow we'll start on winter preparations," Tyler said as they ate by the light of the fire. "Firewood is the priority. We'll need cords of it to get through the cold months." "How much is a cord?" "More than you want to think about. Cutting and splitting firewood is backbreaking work, but there's no substitute for it. The cold up here will kill you faster than hunger or thirst." Sarah nodded, trying not to think about her soft hands and complete lack of experience with physical labor. She would learn, because she had to. The alternative was unthinkable. "Tyler," she said suddenly, "what you said earlier about recognizing something in my eyes. What exactly did you see?" Tyler set down his tin plate and stared into the fire for a long moment. When he looked back at her, his expression was more open than she had seen it before. "Desperation," he said simply. "The kind that comes from being trapped in a life that's slowly killing your soul." I wore that same expression for months before I finally found the courage to leave. And now? Now I see something different. Determination. Strength you didn't know you had. The beginnings of the person you're meant to be. Sarah felt tears threaten again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than fear. For the first time since her flight began, she felt truly seen and understood. "Thank you," she said softly. "Don't thank me yet," Tyler replied, echoing his words from the previous night. "The real test is still ahead of us." The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that gradually began to feel like normalcy. Sarah's days were filled with lessons in survival, each one building on the last until she began to develop genuine competence in the skills that would keep her alive through the coming winter. Tyler proved to be a patient teacher, never showing frustration when she struggled with tasks that seemed second nature to him. He taught her to split firewood with an axe that felt impossibly heavy in her hands at first, but gradually became manageable. He showed her how to preserve meat and vegetables, how to mend clothes and tools, how to read the subtle signs that warned of changing weather. Sarah's hands, once soft and pale from a life of leisure, became calloused and strong. Her body, accustomed to the gentle exercises deemed appropriate for ladies, adapted to the constant physical demands of mountain life. She could feel herself changing, not just physically but mentally as well. The woman who had fled Cedar Falls in a wedding dress seemed like a stranger from another life. The transformation wasn't without its difficulties. There were nights when Sarah lay awake missing the comfort of her childhood bed, the security of knowing exactly what each day would bring. There were moments when the isolation felt overwhelming, when the vast silence of the mountains pressed down on her like a physical weight. But there were also moments of unexpected joy. The morning she successfully started a fire on her first try, earning a rare smile of approval from Tyler. The afternoon she spotted a family of deer grazing in the meadow below the cabin and felt a sense of connection to the wild world around her. The evening she realized she had gone an entire day without thinking about Charles Torres or the life she had left behind. Tyler remained somewhat distant, maintaining the careful boundaries he had established during their first conversation. He was unfailingly helpful and considerate, but Sarah sensed walls around him that went deeper than mere privacy. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, but whenever their eyes met, he would look away and busy himself with some task. The first snow came early that year, arriving in mid-September with a fury that caught even Tyler off guard. Sarah woke to find the world outside transformed, the familiar landscape buried under a blanket of white that made everything look alien and hostile. Early winter, Tyler said grimly, studying the heavy flakes that continued to fall. This could mean a hard season ahead. Sarah felt a flutter of panic at his tone. Are we ready? As ready as we can be, but early snow means a longer winter, and that means our supplies will have to stretch further than planned. They spent the day reinforcing the cabin's defenses against the cold, sealing gaps in the walls, and adding extra insulation wherever possible. Sarah worked alongside Tyler with growing confidence, her hands now skilled enough to be genuinely helpful rather than merely willing. As evening fell and they settled by the fire with their simple dinner, Sarah found herself studying Tyler's profile in the flickering light. Over the weeks of their cohabitation, she had come to appreciate not just his knowledge and competence, but the quiet strength of his character. He was a man who had faced betrayal and loss without becoming bitter, who had chosen solitude without becoming selfish. Tyler, she said suddenly, do you ever get lonely up here? He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Loneliness is different from being alone. I was lonely in civilization, surrounded by people who didn't really see me. Up here, I have solitude, which is something else entirely. But surely you must miss human companionship sometimes. Tyler glanced at her, then back at the fire. Sometimes, but companionship requires trust, and trust requires vulnerability. I'm not sure I'm capable of either anymore. The admission hung between them, heavy with implications that neither of them was quite ready to explore. Sarah understood that Tyler was warning her not to expect more from their relationship than practical cooperation, but she also heard something else in his words, a longing that he was trying very hard to suppress. Elizabeth really hurt you, she said softly. Elizabeth taught me that people aren't always what they seem, that trust can be weaponized, that love can be a trap as easily as a blessing. Sarah felt a surge of anger on Tyler's behalf, thinking of the woman who had destroyed not just his career, but his faith in human connection. Not everyone is like her. No, Tyler agreed. But how do you tell the difference until it's too late? It was a question Sarah couldn't answer, and they finished their meal in contemplative silence. Outside, the wind howled through the pines and the snow continued to fall with relentless persistence. That night, as Sarah lay in her makeshift bed near the fire while Tyler occupied the cabin's single proper bed, she found herself thinking about trust and vulnerability and the walls people built to protect themselves from further harm. She understood Tyler's caution, but she also saw the cost of his self-imposed isolation. He had saved himself from further betrayal, but he had also cut himself off from the possibility of genuine connection. The storm continued for 3 days, trapping them inside the cabin with nothing but each other's company and the books from George Read's modest library. Sarah discovered that Tyler was as well-read as she had suspected, and their conversations ranged from literature to philosophy to the practical challenges of mountain life. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the walls between them began to lower. Tyler shared stories of his teaching days, his voice warming as he described particularly bright students or successful lessons. Sarah talked about her dreams of independence, the books she had read in secret, the future she had imagined for herself before duty and circumstances intervened. When the storm finally broke and they were able to venture outside again, something fundamental had shifted between them. They worked together with an ease that spoke of growing trust, and their conversations carried an intimacy that went beyond mere practical cooperation. November arrived with a cold that seemed to penetrate everything, seeping through the cabin's walls despite Tyler's careful preparations and making every breath visible in the thin mountain air. Sarah had grown accustomed to the physical demands of mountain life, but the psychological challenge of true isolation was just beginning to make itself felt. The snow now lay several feet deep around the cabin, and more fell almost daily. Tyler had been right about the early winter meaning a harsh season. Already they were burning more firewood than he had planned, and the carefully rationed food supplies were being consumed faster than expected. We'll need to be more careful, Tyler said one morning as he checked their stores. At this rate, we'll run short before spring. Sarah felt the familiar flutter of panic that came whenever their precarious situation was mentioned directly. How short? Hard to say. Depends on how long the winter lasts and whether we can supplement our supplies with hunting and foraging. Can we? Tyler's expression was grim. Some. But winter hunting is difficult, and the animals are scarce. We'll have to rely mostly on what we have. The knowledge that their survival was balanced on such a knife's edge should have been terrifying. But Sarah found herself oddly calm. Perhaps it was the gradual toughening of her spirit that had accompanied the strengthening of her body, or perhaps it was simply that she had moved beyond fear into a kind of fatalistic acceptance. "We'll manage," she said with quiet confidence. "We have to." Tyler looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "You've changed, from the woman I found running through the forest in a wedding dress." "I hope so. That woman was weak." "No," Tyler said firmly. "That woman was desperate. There's a difference. Desperation can look like weakness, but it often takes tremendous strength to act on it." Sarah felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spreading through her chest at his words. Over the long weeks of their cohabitation, Tyler's opinion had come to matter to her more than she cared to examine too closely. Their days settled into a routine dictated by the demands of survival and the limitations of their confined space. Morning brought the ritual of rekindling the fire and checking their supplies. Afternoons were spent on maintenance tasks, mending clothes and tools, preparing food, and discussing their plans for the months ahead. Evenings belonged to conversation and reading, the books from George Reed's collection providing escape from the harsh realities of their situation. It was during one of these evening conversations that Sarah finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been troubling her for weeks. "Tyler, what happens in the spring?" He looked up from the book he had been reading, his expression carefully neutral. "What do you mean?" "I mean when the snow melts and the passes open again. What happens to me then?" Tyler was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. Sarah waited, her heart hammering with anxiety over his answer. "That depends on what you want to happen," he said finally. "I can't go back to Cedar Falls. Even if Charles Torres would still have me, which seems unlikely, I could never face that life again." "Then you don't go back." "But I can't stay here forever. This is your place, your life. I have no right to impose on it indefinitely." Tyler closed his book and set it aside, giving her his full attention. "Sarah, do you think I've minded having you here?" The question caught her off guard. "Etienne, I don't know. You've been very kind, but I know you value your solitude." "I did value it. Past tense. Having you here has reminded me of things I thought I'd given up permanently." "Such as?" "Conversation, companionship, the pleasure of sharing experiences with someone who understands their significance." Sarah felt her breath catch at the quiet intensity in his voice. "Tyler, I'm not saying this to pressure you or make you feel obligated. I'm saying it because you have a right to know that your presence here hasn't been a burden. Quite the opposite." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Sarah felt her heart racing as she tried to process the implications of Tyler's words. Was he saying what she thought he was saying? And if so, how did she feel about it? The truth was, she had grown more than comfortable with their arrangement. She had come to treasure their conversations, to rely on Tyler's steady presence, to feel a sense of partnership that went far beyond mere survival. But she had assumed those feelings were one-sided, that Tyler was simply too polite to express his impatience with her continued presence. "I've grown fond of this life too," she said carefully. "More fond than I expected. Even with all the hardships, the isolation, the constant work, the uncertainty, especially because of those things. They're real in a way my old life never was. Every day here matters. Every choice has consequences. I feel more alive than I ever did in Cedar Falls." Tyler nodded slowly, as if her words confirmed something he had hoped to hear. "Then perhaps we should discuss what a permanent arrangement might look like." "Permanent? Marriage, Sarah. I'm talking about marriage." The word hit her like a physical blow, bringing with it a flood of memories from her flight from the altar. Marriage had been the trap she was running from. the cage that would have defined and limited her for the rest of her life. But this was different, wasn't it? Tyler wasn't Charles Torres, and the life he was offering bore no resemblance to the one she had fled. This would be a partnership between equals, a choice made freely rather than a duty imposed by circumstances. I know it's not what you expected when you ran from your wedding, Tyler continued, misreading her silence as rejection. And I understand if the idea of marriage itself is repugnant to you now. It's not that, Sarah said quickly. It's just, I need time to think. Tyler nodded, his expression carefully controlled. Of course, it's a big decision, and there's no hurry. We have all winter to figure things out. December brought blizzards that lasted for days, trapping them inside the cabin with nothing but each other's company and the dwindling supplies that represented their lifeline to spring. The cold was so intense that ice formed on the inside of the windows despite the constant fire, and Sarah learned to sleep fully clothed to ward off the chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. It was during one of these storms, as they sat huddled close to the fire for warmth, that the conversation Sarah had been avoiding finally became unavoidable. "Have you given any more thought to what I said?" Tyler asked quietly. Sarah had thought of little else, but she was no closer to an answer than she had been weeks earlier. The idea of marriage still carried the weight of her recent trauma, but she couldn't deny the growing attraction she felt toward the man who had become her protector and companion. "I'm afraid," she admitted, "of me, of marriage itself, of losing myself again in someone else's expectations." Tyler was quiet for a moment, and then shifted closer to her on the rough wooden bench they shared. "What if I told you that what I'm proposing isn't marriage as you've known it? No legal ceremony, no social obligations, no transfer of property or authority, just two people choosing to build a life together as equals." The idea was radical, almost scandalous by the standards Sarah had been raised with. But then, everything about her current situation would have been scandalous to the people of Cedar Falls. Perhaps it was time to stop measuring her choices by their standards. What would that look like, practically speaking? Like what we have now, but with the understanding that it's permanent. We'd be partners in every sense, sharing the work and the decisions and the risks. Your voice would carry equal weight with mine in everything that affects us both. Sarah felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen at his words. This was what she had always dreamed of without quite being able to articulate it. A relationship based on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than dominance and submission. And if it doesn't work? If we discover we're not compatible in the long term? Tyler's smile was sad but understanding. Then we'll face that problem when it comes. But Sarah, we've already spent months in closer quarters than most married couples ever experience. We've seen each other at our worst and our best. If we were going to drive each other mad, don't you think it would have happened by now? He had a point. Their enforced intimacy had revealed no hidden incompatibilities, no fundamental differences in values or temperament that would make a permanent partnership impossible. If anything, the challenges they had faced together had strengthened the bond between them. "There's something else," Tyler said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something I haven't told you." Sarah looked at him expectantly, noting the way his jaw tightened as if he were steeling himself for a difficult admission. "I'm in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating in their honesty. Sarah felt her heart stop, then begin racing as the full impact of his confession hit her. "Tyler, I don't expect you to feel the same way. I know this situation isn't exactly conducive to romance, and I know your recent experiences have given you every reason to be wary of men's motives. But I needed you to know because it affects everything else we've been discussing." Sarah stared at him, seeing him as if for the first time. The strong lines of his face, weathered by mountain weather and marked by the pain of his past. The dark eyes that had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. The hands that had taught her to serve him, that had never touched her without permission or necessity. When had she fallen in love with him? She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, but she could trace the progression. The gratitude that had gradually deepened into trust. The trust that had grown into affection. The affection that had somehow transformed into something much more profound without her quite realizing it. I think I might love you too, she whispered. Tyler's eyes widened, and for a moment his careful control slipped, revealing the depth of emotion he had been keeping in check. You think? I know I do. I just wasn't ready to admit it, even to myself. Tyler reached for her hands, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Sarah, are you sure? I don't want you to confuse gratitude or dependence with love. Do you think I'm that naive? I think you're someone who's been through tremendous upheaval and might be vulnerable to confusing different kinds of feelings. Sarah appreciated his concern, but she was more certain of her feelings than she had ever been of anything in her life. Tyler, I ran away from a marriage based on duty and financial necessity. Do you really think I would choose another marriage for the wrong reasons? No, he said slowly. I suppose you wouldn't. Then trust me when I say that what I feel for you has nothing to do with gratitude or dependence. You've shown me what it means to be valued for who I am rather than what I can provide. You've taught me that I'm stronger than I ever imagined. You've given me a life worth living. How could I not love you for that? Tyler lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was tender and reverent, nothing like the possessive claims Charles Torres had made on her person. Then yes, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was committing to. Yes, I'll marry you, or whatever we want to call the arrangement we're making. Tyler's smile transformed his entire face, erasing years of careful guardedness and revealing the man he had been before life had taught him to be so careful with his heart. I love you, Sarah James. I love you too, Tyler Ross. Their first kiss happened later that night as the storm raged outside and the fire burned low in the grate. It was gentle and tentative, a question asked and answered without words. Tyler's lips were warm against hers, and Sarah felt something inside her that had been held in tight control finally relax and open. When they broke apart, Tyler rested his forehead against hers, his breathing slightly unsteady. Are you sure about this? All of it? I've never been more sure of anything. It won't be easy building a life up here. The isolation, the harsh conditions, the constant work just to survive. I know, but it will be our life, built on our terms. That's worth any amount of hardship. Tyler pulled back to look at her, his dark eyes searching her face as if memorizing every detail. You're remarkable, do you know that? 6 months ago, you were a sheltered town girl who had never faced real hardship. Now you're ready to commit to a life that would break most people. 6 months ago, I was half dead from living a life that wasn't mine. Now I'm fully alive for the first time. You did that, Tyler. You in these mountains and the choice to finally fight for what I wanted instead of accepting what I was given. We did that together. Sarah smiled, loving the way he instinctively thought in terms of partnership rather than individual achievement. It was so different from the men she had known in Cedar Falls, who saw women as prizes to be won or burdens to be managed rather than equals to be respected. They talked long into the night, making plans for their future with the careful attention to detail that mountain life demanded. They would need to expand the cabin before next winter, adding space for the children they both hoped to have someday. They would need to develop more reliable sources of food and income, perhaps trading Tyler's craftsmanship for supplies from the valley below. What about your family? Tyler asked as dawn began to lighten the windows. Do you think you'll ever want to see them again? Sarah considered the question carefully. The anger and hurt from her parents' willingness to sacrifice her happiness for financial security had faded somewhat over the months, replaced by a sadder but more mature understanding of the pressures they had faced. Maybe someday, when enough time has passed for the scandal to die down and they can see me as I am now, rather than as the daughter who disappointed them. And if they never come around, then that's their loss. I won't let their approval or disapproval dictate my choices anymore. Tyler nodded, understanding the difficult balance between love and independence that defines so many family relationships. What about Charles Torres? Any regrets there? Sarah laughed, surprised by how genuinely amused she felt at the question. Only that I didn't run sooner. I heard through the grapevine that he married the banker's daughter 3 months after I left. Apparently she was much more suitable than I ever was. His loss, too. His gain, more likely. She'll make him the kind of wife he actually wanted, and he'll make her the kind of husband she can tolerate. They'll be perfectly miserable together in the socially acceptable way. Tyler chuckled at her sardonic assessment. You've become quite cynical about conventional marriage. Not cynical, realistic. I understand now that what most people call marriage is actually a business arrangement dressed up in romantic language. What we're choosing is something entirely different. What are we choosing? Sarah thought for a moment, trying to find words for something that felt too large and complex for easy definition. Partnership, love, the freedom to be ourselves with someone who sees and values who we really are. That sounds like the best kind of marriage to me. As spring finally began to show the signs of arriving, with longer days and the first tentative melting of the snow, Sarah and Tyler began making concrete plans for their future together. They would formalize their union in their own way, with vows spoken to each other under the open sky rather than in a church filled with disapproving witnesses. The ceremony, when it finally took place on a warm day in May, was simple and perfect. They stood in the meadow below the cabin, surrounded by wildflowers and watched by the peaks that had sheltered them through the long winter. Tyler had carved simple rings from mountain oak, and they exchanged them along with vows they had written themselves. I promise to stand beside you as an equal, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. To share in your struggles and your joys. To respect your independence while offering my partnership. To love you not for what you can provide, but for who you are. Tyler's vows were equally simple and profound. I promise to see you as you truly are, not as I might wish you to be. To support your dreams while pursuing my own. To offer you my strength while respecting yours. To love you with the freedom that allows you to remain yourself. There were no witnesses except the mountains themselves, no legal documents or social obligations. Just two people choosing each other with full knowledge of what that choice meant. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the same meadow where she and Tyler had exchanged vows. But now she was not alone. In her arms, she held their daughter, a tiny girl with Tyler's dark eyes and Sarah's stubborn chin. The baby gurgled contentedly, apparently unbothered by the high altitude that had taken Sarah months to adjust to. She's going to be a mountain girl through and through, Tyler said, joining them after completing his morning chores. He dropped a gentle kiss on his daughter's forehead, then another on Sarah's lips. Just like her mother, Sarah replied, still amazed by how natural the words felt. She was a mountain woman now, as different from the frightened bride who had fled Cedar Falls as it was possible to be while remaining the same person. Their life together had not been without challenges. The second winter had been even harsher than the first, and Sarah's pregnancy had added complications they hadn't anticipated. There had been moments of doubt, times when the isolation and hardship had tested their commitment to each other and to the life they were building. But they had weathered every storm together, their partnership growing stronger with each challenge overcome. Tyler had been right about the transformative power of the mountains. They had burned away everything that wasn't essential, leaving behind only what was true and lasting. Any regrets? Tyler asked, echoing a question that had become a ritual between them. Only that I didn't run away sooner, Sarah replied, giving the answer that had become her standard response. But as she looked out over the valley below where Cedar Falls sat like a distant memory, she felt a surprising absence of bitterness toward her past. The woman who had stood at the altar in a wedding dress she hated, about to marry a man she could never love, had been necessary to create the woman she was now. Every moment of desperation and fear had led to this moment of perfect contentment. A movement on the trail below caught her attention, and she shaded her eyes to get a better look. A lone rider was making his way up the mountain, the first visitor they had seen in months. Expecting company? Sarah asked. Tyler followed her gaze, his expression growing alert. Unexpected visitors in the high country were rarely good news. No, but whoever it is, they're determined. That's a hard climb for someone who doesn't know the trails. As the rider drew closer, Sarah felt her heart skip with recognition. Even at a distance, there was something familiar about the set of the shoulders, the way the man sat his horse. I think that's my father, she said quietly. Tyler's hand found hers, offering silent support. They had always known this moment might come eventually, but that didn't make it any less complicated. George James dismounted at the edge of the meadow, his movements stiff with age and the long ride. He looked older than Sarah remembered, his hair more gray, his face more lined. But his eyes were the same, and they fixed on her with an expression of wonder and relief. "Sarah," he said simply. "Papa." The word came out more emotional than she had intended, carrying with it all the complicated feelings she had been holding at bay for over a year. George's gaze moved to Tyler, assessing him with the careful attention of a father meeting his daughter's husband for the first time. Then his eyes fell on the baby in Sarah's arms, and his expression softened completely. "My granddaughter?" "Elizabeth," Sarah said, naming the child after Tyler's lost student in a gesture of healing that had meant everything to her husband. Elizabeth rose. George stepped closer, his weathered hands gentle as he touched the baby's tiny fist. "She's beautiful. She looks like you did at that age." "How did you find us?" Sarah asked. "It wasn't easy. Took me months of asking questions and following rumors. Most people said you were dead, lost in the mountains during that first winter. But I never believed it. You were always too stubborn to die easily." Sarah laughed despite herself, recognizing the backhanded compliment as her father's way of expressing love. "What made you come looking?" George was quiet for a moment, his attention focused on the baby who was studying him with serious dark eyes. "Your mother's dying," he said finally. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs. "What?" "Consumption. Started last winter and got worse through the spring. The doctor says she has maybe a few months left." Sarah felt Tyler's hand tighten on hers, offering strength and support. She had known this day would come eventually, but she had imagined having more time to prepare, more opportunity to heal the wounds that had driven them apart. "She wants to see you," George continued, "wants to meet her granddaughter. And she wants to apologize for the choice we made, forcing you toward a marriage you didn't want." "She has nothing to apologize for," Sarah said, surprised by how much she meant it. "You were doing what you thought was best for everyone." "We were doing what was easiest for us," George corrected. "There's a difference. We should have found another way. Should have trusted you to help us figure out a solution that didn't require sacrificing your happiness." Sarah looked at Tyler, seeing understanding and encouragement in his eyes. Whatever she decided, he would support her choice. "We'll come," she said finally, "not to stay, but to visit, so she can meet Elizabeth and see that I'm happy." George's relief was palpable. "Thank you. I know it's a lot to ask, after everything that happened." "Family is complicated," Sarah said, "but it's still family." As they prepared for the journey down to Cedar Falls, Sarah reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. A year ago, she had been running from everything her father represented. Now she was returning as a wife and mother, secure in her own identity and capable of extending forgiveness to those who had hurt her. The woman who had fled her wedding in a torn dress had been running from a life that would have destroyed her. The woman who was preparing to visit her dying mother was running towards something much more important: the chance to heal old wounds and show her family that love could take many forms. Tyler helped her pack their few belongings, his movements efficient and calm. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "I'm sure. It's time to close that chapter properly, to show them that I didn't just survive my choice, but thrived because of it." As they began their descent toward the valley, Sarah looked back once at the cabin that had become home, at the meadow where she had found love and purpose and the strength to be herself. The mountains would be waiting when they returned, offering the same promise they had given her on that desperate night when she had first fled into their embrace: the freedom to choose her own path, no matter how difficult or unconventional it might be. The runaway bride was going home, but she was returning as someone entirely new. Someone who had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love was having the courage to run toward the life you were meant to live, even when that meant running away from everything you had known before. And in Tyler's steady presence beside her, in their daughter's trusting weight in her arms, in the knowledge that the mountains would welcome them back whenever they chose to return, Sarah carried the proof that some risks were worth taking, some choices were worth the consequences, and some kinds of love were worth running toward, no matter how far the journey might be.